to have Dick Munson with us. I know Dick from his position at EDF, which is the Environmental Defense Fund, where he's been very, very active for a good number of years. And he wrote this terrific biography of Tesla last year. So I thought that we should all know about what is in this book about Tesla. So he has agreed to come down, and I'm very, very pleased that we can hear firsthand from him about this book. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for the invite and the invitation. Do I need this? Or? Well, thanks for having me. We are here to talk about Nikola Tesla, who is enjoying a little bit of a popular revival, largely because Elon Musk has this car and this company that everybody points to. But there's also a bunch of other luminaries that have been Tesla supporters. The one that sort of spurred me to write this book is Larry Page, Google's co-founder, who I was leafing through in a magazine article, and he was quoted as saying that Nikola Tesla was his hero. So I figured if good enough for Larry Page, I should find out more about this guy. That said, despite all these, endorsers, he still is far less well known than Thomas Edison or Marconi. And those people that do know him tend to be divided into two different camps. One side views him as, a Superman, a person who basically invented everything, as an icon, could do no wrong. On the other hand, you have people who view him as a bit of an eccentric, because he's kind of quirky, to be quite honest. I mean, he hated jewelry. He'd get a little fever if he saw a peach. He'd have to count his steps while he was walking, and if they were not divisible by 3, he'd have to go and do the entire trip all over again. I want to suggest those stories I can go on for a long time about. But I guess I want to suggest that I think he is more remarkable and more interesting than either of those extremes. So what I thought I would do for maybe about 20 minutes, a half an hour, is talk about 5 things during the course of my research that surprised me about Nikola Tesla that maybe might prompt you to want to learn more about him. So if that's okay, I hope that we end up having a bunch of questions, because that's probably the best part. But the first thing that should not have surprised me particularly is just the extent of this man's inventing. He has 300 patents, and he is credited with inventing the electric motor, long-distance electricity transmission, radio, remote control, robots. These are the very foundations of our modern economy. In fact, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers said, were we to seize and eliminate from our industrial world the results of Mr. Tesla's work, the wheels of industry would cease to turn and our towns would be dark. So even these are things that he actually accomplished that you got to see, but even after his death, he continued to inspire great minds for generations. He came up with schematics and designs and descriptions of things that range from the cell phone to radar, laser weapons, artificial intelligence, vertical lift aircraft. The list sort of goes on and on. Take radar, for example. He, in about 100 years ago, actually 100 years ago, he drew the schematics for a plan as to how to send out signals and then record their reflections on a fluorescent screen. He didn't have the equipment to be able to do it, but the gentleman, the Frenchman, 20 years later, who is credited with devising radar, said the only reason he was able to do it is because he followed exactly the apparatus and the principles that were described by Nikola Tesla. He went so far as to say Tesla may have been dreaming, since he had at his disposal no means of carrying them out, but one must add that if he was dreaming, at least he was dreaming correctly. So recall that in the late 19th and early 20th century, electricity was a very new and mysterious force. This will date me, but my grandparents, grew up in a house where light came from candles or kerosene lamps, and heat came from a wood stove. Even when they got their own house, they preferred having lighting from natural gas because they thought it was a more pleasant glow and it was cheaper. It's also, electricity at this time was also viewed in some ways as a frightening force. The Secret Service, for instance, would not allow President Benjamin Harrison to flick on the light switch in the White House because they were convinced he would electrocute himself. So in the midst of this new mysterious force, this gentleman, Nikola Tesla, we can go forward.
I guess they don't have that fear restraint today.
Yeah. Don't get me off on that one. So he is viewed as this magician, this man who's capable of manipulating this new energy source. He created lightning. This was something that had been reserved for nature alone. He made lamps glow through an electrical force, even though they were not connected to wires. He was this amazing gentleman. He, of course, advanced some, if you will, quixotic notions that you could say made his reputation a bit more complicated, or I would argue made him more interesting. He spent a fair amount of time, for instance, trying to figure out how to communicate with intelligent beings on other planets. He spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to read your mind by putting monitors not far from your retina. He also, like all of us, and particularly inventors who are on the cutting edge, he made mistakes. You know, even after the Wright brothers' flight, he was convinced that airplanes were too heavy to soar, and he was far more interested in the dirigibles being developed by Count Zeppelin. Even after Einstein's theories were generally accepted, he kept arguing that cosmic rays could travel faster than light, and that if you split an atom, you're not really going to get a whole lot of energy. That said, I guess I want to argue, the thing that surprised me is that his batting average, for lack of a better word, was remarkable. He gave us all of these core foundations of our modern economy, the electric motor, robots, remote control. And I think he also inspired others to develop an array of devices that are now dominating our daily lives. So surprise number two, a pleasant one for me because, as was noted, my day job, I work for the Environmental Defense Fund, advancing energy efficiency and renewable energy. And so it was pleasant for me to realize that Nikola Tesla was actually a clean energy pioneer. And he remains sort of an inspiration to several of the solar and battery entrepreneurs today, including Elon Musk, who recently contributed $1 million to restore the Tesla laboratory up on Long Island. So he marked his clean energy leadership with an article in the year 1900 in the Century magazine, which at the time was the largest periodical in the United States. It was entitled "The Problem of Increasing Human Energy with Special References to the Harnessing of the Sun's Energy." So this was published 119 years ago, and it was probably one of the first and most detailed descriptions of how do you capture power from the sunlight, from the wind, from temperature differentials in the earth. Surprise number three. I guess it was to realize that he was human, and charmingly so. Most of the things that had previously been written about Nikola Tesla portray him as this Superman. One biographer called him, the supernova in the galaxy of the human race. One of the joys of writing actually convinced me of this surprise. I was at the archives at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and they had brought out 3 boxes filled with technical scientific papers that Tesla had written, schematics of his designs, patent applications, and things of that sort. I should probably not admit it in this building, but I am not an engineer. My eyes were beginning to glaze over. So I go back to the librarian and say, "You got anything else?" And out he brings these 2 boxes that are filled with letters. Letters between Tesla and his friends, Tesla and his business associates, and suddenly this man, this Superman, had a voice. He became alive. And he had friends, actually quite a few of them. His closest were the Johnsons, Robert Johnson, who edited the Century magazine, and then his wife, Catherine. They operated, I guess, an intellectual salon in their stately Murray Hill townhouse in Manhattan. They were not particularly wealthy, but they did gather together for dinners these luminary writers, artists, and sculptors. And one frequent guest Please tell me you know this guy. This is Mark Twain. So he would often come over to these dinners, and they'd have these great times. And then afterwards, Twain and Tesla would go back to Tesla's laboratory, where they played like a bunch of kids in a great toy house. They took X-rays of each other's hands and feet. They shot electrical beams all across, or lightning, if you will, across the laboratory. They danced about and ran about with bulbs or globes or sabers that were not attached to wires. So Tesla's relationships with Twain, and I think also with Robert, and this is a later picture of Catherine, they reveal a jovial, a relaxed side to this normally very intense and private inventor. They exchanged daily notes, if not more than that, talking about the activities of the Johnson children, what Tesla was working on, what articles the Century magazine was reviewing. There was one of these letters in this box that I just thought sums up the closeness of their relationship. Tesla had had a cold for about a week, and so Robert sends him a note, basically inviting him to dinner. It says, "It's been a whole week since we saw you, and you need cheering up. Come as early as possible and get cheered. We are in a jolly mood, and the fire is lighted on the hearth, and we only need you." I sort of like that one. This Superman suddenly becomes human. So they remain friends all of their life, even after Robert became U.S. ambassador to Italy. And the very last note that Catherine wrote before she died was to demand that her husband maintain close contact with Nikola Tesla throughout his life. Tesla, despite these numerous friendships, he never married. He did have one love of his life when he was 23 years old, a young girl named Anna. They spent a joyous summer wandering through the parks of Austria, she planning the family and he thinking about returning to engineering school. As you might imagine, or you might know, the relationship did not last. He did, in fact, go off to engineering school, and I understand from people here it takes a lot of your attention. But also, he was a germaphobe who didn't like touching other people and certainly hated other people touching him, which is not exactly one of the attributes you want for a long-term relationship. But he also, despite that, he enjoyed flirting. In the letters that he went back and forth with the Johnsons, he would have his favorite female companions that he would hope would come to dinner. He would say, for instance, if Miss Merrington was going to come that night, I'll certainly be there and I'll be her willing victim. He, however, despite all of this banter, he concluded that inventors could not marry. He said matrimony might be okay for artists, for musicians, for writers. The emotional wimps, I think, might be his view of it. But he said for an inventor, inventors have such an intense a nature with so much of it of wild, passionate quality that in giving himself to a woman he might love, he would give up everything and take everything from his chosen field. Now, one of the last little notes in this box that I received was when he was older, and he reiterated this pledge that he thought inventors should not marry. But there was this note at the end of it which makes you somewhat sad, because he commented and said, "It's a pity, because for sometimes we feel so lonely." So the fourth surprise was simply the sheer drama associated with Tesla's personal life. There are lots of stories. My wife tells me I can't tell many, otherwise you would never consider buying the book. But let me tell you two. He was born a Serb in what is now Croatia. His family lived in a modest house, and his father, who was an Orthodox priest, oversaw an isolated church that serviced maybe about 50 families throughout the valley. And those buildings are now a popular tourist attraction in a region of the world where Tesla is far better known than Edison or Marconi. He claims that his early years were blissful. He was doted over by two older sisters. He had the run of the farm. He had a special fondness for what he described as the finest of all cats in the world. But that blissfulness did not last. When he was 7 years old, he had an older brother whose name was Dane, who was Nikola's idol and also the family favorite, who was considered gifted beyond all means and would follow his father into the clergy. Well, so when Dane was 12 years old, Nikola is 7, and the family's Arabian horse bolted and threw Dane to the ground, and he died that evening from his injuries from the fall. And on top of that, Tesla witnessed this scene of seeing his brother fly through the air and come crashing down and become comatose. But then his mother, on top of that, wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, "Come kiss your dead brother goodbye." Whoa, at 7 years old, you're whacked with this baby. And he said even 55 years later, he noted in one letter that my visual impression of my brother's death has lost none of its force. So there's some drama. You would think now that the family would turn to their remaining son and nourish him so that he became the idol of the family. But they, the parents, particularly his father, the Orthodox priest, increasingly idolized the dead boy's talents and consistently projected what would have happened if, in fact, Dane had lived. So Nikola had this ideal that he just could not live up to. He was obviously bright. He could speak and write in 8 different languages. He could recite poems and entire short stories from memory. And yet he would say, anything I did that was credible merely caused my parents to feel their loss more keenly. I grew up with little confidence in myself. This is the Superman of inventing, growing up with little confidence in himself. His father demanded that he now become a priest. Nikola wanted to become an engineer and became one only because he was clever enough that on his dying bed, Nikola was dying of cholera, he somehow coughed out that he would be able to recover if, in fact, he was allowed to go to engineering school. Yeah. And they let him. And he goes for 2 years to engineering school, and he gets the greatest marks that any student has ever had at this academy. Taking advanced classes, gets perfect recommendations from all of his professors. What does his father say? Dane would have done better. Crushed. Nikola Tesla then dropped out of school. He took up gambling and billiards, moved to another town about 100 miles away without telling anybody, got arrested for vagrancy, was brought back to his home by the police. You can imagine the shock of his parents, his father of which died not long thereafter. So that's drama. One other story of drama. His first jobs were to install Edison phone systems in Budapest and Paris. He actually spent most of his time trying to figure out how to make an electric motor, and we can come back to this, but to demonstrate his genius, he devised in his mind this revolutionary electric motor while he was walking through a Budapest park and quoting the entire length of this lengthy poem, Faust. And so when he gets this idea, he suddenly grabs a stick and draws a design for it in the sand nearby. He was recognized for his ingenuity, obviously, and so he was sent to New York City to work with the great man himself, Thomas Edison. Tesla's European supervisor gave Tesla probably the greatest letter of recommendation you could ever get from anybody. He says, writing a note to Thomas Edison, he says, "I know of 2 great men. You were one of them, Thomas Edison, and this young man is the other." He obviously got the job, but the 2 great men did not hit it off. They clearly had different styles. Edison was a little frumpy and grumpy and crass and chewing tobacco and spitting it all over the place. Tesla, this European cosmopolitan speaking 8 different languages, usually was dressed like he was going to the opera. They had different inventing styles. Thomas Edison was a trial and error guy. You put a lot of stuff on the table and he'd try to figure out what combination of things might go together to make an incandescent light bulb that lasted. Tesla didn't like that. He did what he referred to as cerebral engineering. Everything was done in his head. He saw it, he revised it again and again until it was finally completed in his head, and only then would he draw the designs. And he would claim, inaccurately a bit, that he didn't have to change them after that point. More importantly, the two of them disagreed vehemently about how electricity should be transmitted. Edison wanted it done by low voltage, direct current, and Nikola Tesla favored the higher voltage alternating current. We can get back into that as well. But what really caused the split is that Tesla felt that Edison had promised him a bonus if he, Tesla, was able to increase the output of the Edison generators. So Tesla works on the weekends, late in the evenings for about 6 months, and figures out how to triple the output of the Edison generator. Goes to the Wizard of Menlo Park and says, "Can I get my bonus?" And in probably the greatest slight that you can give to a new immigrant, Thomas Edison turns to him and says, "Oh, that was just made in jest. And when you become a real American, you will appreciate an American joke." Tesla did not laugh, as you might imagine. He picked up his bowler hat, left, started his own company, actually a street lighting company in Rahway, New Jersey, and unfortunately in what would become somewhat of a pattern, because he might have been a brilliant inventor, but he was a horrible businessman. He got swindled by his business partners, and he spent the next year of his life digging ditches, making only $2 a day, this brilliant man. He was not your typical ditch digger. They were digging ditches to lay, telegraph wires. So while they were digging, he was out there commenting to the supervisor how you might increase the efficiency of the telegraph lines and get more and faster traffic going through it. So finally, somebody said, "All right, you're smart," and they realized that he was able to sell his electric motor patents. Remember those things that he developed while he was in the Budapest Park? He sold them to George Westinghouse, and then he helped this Pittsburgh industrialist with the contract to light and power the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which at the time was the greatest assemblage of electric lights and motors the world had ever seen. So Tesla was on a roll. He got this great contract from George Westinghouse. He moved into the Waldorf Astoria, the elite hotel of New York City at the time. He ate his dinners, usually filet mignon, at the fancy Delmonico restaurant. But again, blissfulness in Nikola Tesla's case would not last. But this time, largely because Tesla was an idealist rather than a businessman or a negotiator. So just for some context, think about the time after Westinghouse and Tesla completed the Niagara Falls project, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Westinghouse was a little bit short on cash because they had spent so much making the delivery of this power all the way to New York City. And so J.P. Morgan, ruthless Wall Street banker that he was, tried to squeeze Westinghouse and take over his company. So Westinghouse had to figure out some way to reduce his expenses. And one of his biggest expenses was a royalty to Nikola Tesla, $2.50 per horsepower for every motor that he sold. Tesla had all the negotiating power. He owned the patents. He had a contract. But in dramatic style, probably more exaggerated than what really happened, but he turns to George Westinghouse in his idealistic way and says, "You have been my friend. You are the one man who is going to bring my invention, the electric motor, to the world and reduce everyone's drudgery. Let me tear up my contract." And right there, he tore up what was probably, I went back to calculate it, about worth $900 million in our dollars today. Who would do that? Tesla, as you probably guessed, had little appreciation for money. On numerous occasions, he would suggest that money, what do I need it for? I would enjoy it only if I had a room full of this paper and I would throw it out the window. What thrilled him was not money, but it was sort of the thrill, the ideal, if you will, of inventing. So my final surprise of 5, actually what held the book together were provides a theme that pervaded Tesla's life was the realization that he consistently struggled between balancing the present and the future. You could call it apocryphal, you could call it weird, you could call it appropriate, but this man who gave us artificial lightning was born during a violent lightning storm. Even more weird, he was born at the exact stroke of midnight between the 9th and 10th of July, 1856. So this birth story, at least figuratively for a biographer, suddenly placed him both in the present as well as the future, both in today as well as tomorrow. So throughout his life, he actually had this struggle to find a balance between focusing on the current realities or on envisioning the future. And if he went too far one way or the other, he got unmoored. So if he was so focused on the today and dealing with patent lawyers and other engineers who were questioning him, he became bored and just grumpy and irritable. If he was only envisioning the future, he went off and did bizarre things that would never become realized. So consider where he was in 1897. He and Westinghouse had just transmitted electricity from Niagara Falls, first 26 miles to Buffalo, and then a remarkable 400 miles all the way to New York City, where it powered the new subway and lighted the Great White Way of Broadway. Recall that Thomas Edison's direct current approach could only send electricity about a half a mile. So this is a remarkable 400 miles. The New York Times referred to the Niagara project as the unrivaled engineering triumph of the 19th century. And the paper declared that to Tesla alone belongs the undisputed honor of being the man whose work made this Niagara project possible. There are statues that commemorate his work on both the U.S. and the Canadian side. But think about this balance again. He had just done something remarkable, the unrivaled engineering triumph of the 19th century. And where was Nikola Tesla? Bored. Done that. Got to start thinking about the future. That's today. So he decided that he would create an entire new field that he would call telemetonics. We would probably now refer to it as robotics. And his initial project was a radio-controlled model boat measured about 4 feet high, maybe about 3 feet long. Tesla was most happy, of course, when he was alone in his lab, but he could become a showman when he needed to. And so he arranged for the Telematon's debut at the massive Madison Square Garden, that's the old one, during the Electrical Exposition of May 1898. History buffs will recall that this is about 2 months after the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor at the start of the Spanish-American War. So we are kind of interested in new possible weapons. And so Tesla erects this indoor pond and invites military officers, scientists, reporters, and possible inventors. And then he tantalizes them with moving this battery-powered boat forward and backwards, then around the pond. It sort of danced almost a bit like a butterfly. No one had ever seen anything like this. The papers the following day were filled with comments by people who were in the audience. One suggested, or several actually suggested, they thought it was a magical spirit that was controlling it. My favorite was some person suggested that there was a tiny little monkey inside that was moving the thing backwards and forwards. So he mesmerized the crowd, and then he turns to them and he asks, who wants to ask the boat a question? Everybody's silent. What do you mean ask the boat a question? You don't ask boats questions. And so probably in this audience, some engineering nerd, said, okay, what's the square root of 16? And Tesla, you can notice his hand over here by the controls. He had mastered individualized messages. So he puts his hand over here and clicks a button that causes the lights on the boat to flash 4 times. He said, it created a sensation such as no other invention of mine has ever produced. So his success is further highlighted by Marconi's failure. About 3 months later, Marconi does virtually the same thing. He builds another indoor pond, and he puts at the end of the pond over here a Spanish frigate. Remember the Spanish-American War, so he's trying to convince to get a military contract. And then he had his remote control boat, and he had a tiny little bomb that was on it. And so he would maneuver, the boat around and around, and it docked it right next to the Spanish boat. And then he didn't really know how to do individualized messages, punched the button. The Spanish ship is just fine. But suddenly in the back room where they had stored the rest of the miniature bombs, it just went kaboom! And so debris and noise and everything else sort of fills the entire place. So Tesla kind of won that one. But not surprisingly, his vast imagination and his focus on tomorrow caused him to envision something far grander than a remote control boat, even far grander than a weapons delivery system. To him, this was the first non-biological form of life. This was a machine with an embodied mind. And he foresaw artificial intelligence. He predicted that this telematon not only would follow a course laid out or obey commands given far in advance. That's pretty easy. No, he said that this boat will be able to distinguish between what it ought and what it ought not to do. That was 118 years ago. He was thinking about this stuff. So my 5 points in conclusion, I guess I would say that beyond his dramatic life, beyond his charming friendships, he was, I think, at his core, someone who just reveled in the excitement of discovery. He would write, "I do not think there is any thrill that can go through the human heart like that felt by the inventor as he sees some creation of the brain unfolding to success." So throughout his life, he was a curiosity-driven inventor. He was motivated by idealism, which sometimes came back and haunted him since he lost $900 million. Edison developed products because they would make a profit. And I'm not criticizing that at all. That's the way our system works, and he was great at it. But Tesla believed that technology transcended the marketplace and that invention should not just be tied to profits. He wrote, "The desire that guides me in all that I do is to harness the forces of nature to the service of mankind." The obituaries at the time went out of their way to suggest that he was a man ahead of his time. Some suggested that he was so far ahead of his contemporaries that his patents often expired before they could be put to practical use. I want to argue that he aimed high. He probably was a Superman in some regard, a charming one. He worked tirelessly for idealistic purposes. He wanted to bring electric power freely to everyone in the world. He wanted to create robots that would reduce life's drudgery. He was driven, never accepting the status quo, by sort of internal forces that made sheer creation the most important thing of his life. And I guess I want to argue in the book that we are all the better for it. So here's a few shots of him throughout the years. Got on a 75th birthday, he got on the cover of Time magazine. That's my story. I hope you have some questions. Thanks very much. You have a question? I planted one because I wasn't sure. What a great question. Throughout his 60s and even into his 70s, he had this event where he would invite reporters into his room at the New Yorker hotel, and you had like 30 of the top reporters in the nation from the New York Times, the New York Herald, and others came and sat at his feet for like 4 hours and listened to him pontificate about radar, remote controls, what have you. He sometimes had weird things, like he thought that the way to good mental health was that before going to bed you would scrunch your toes 100 times. That made headlines. But the thing that he kept coming back to was his idea for a death beam, something that could be shot out of, like a electronic cannon, a Star Wars practice that would blow up airplanes as well as, battleships. And so he dies in the year 1943, middle of World War II. You can imagine the FBI is not really keen about letting the schematics for a death beam get into the hands of the Serbian or the Yugoslav, government at the time. So they, the FBI, gather all his boxes, his papers, everything from any place that he had ever worked or lived, and then they hire a professor to come down and read everything and to see if there's anything that is dangerous for the war effort. So this guy comes down from MIT. He's the head of their high voltage research lab. Member of the National Academy of Science, very respected, and he spends 6 days in New York City, looked over by naval intelligence and the FBI agents as he goes through this. And he says, 90% of the stuff, 95% of the stuff is just sort of the ramblings of, unfocused sort of older man. I can say that in my age. But he said there's this one part about the death beam that was so specific, he slapped a super high, top secret classification on it. And to be honest, I don't think it's ever been released, which leads to lots of conspiracy theories. But here's the question. This is just one of the serendipities of history. The professor from MIT that they brought down, distinguished man that he was, is named John Trump. John Trump is uncle to the 45th president of the United States. How's that for weird? And in fact, during the campaign, Donald Trump, candidate Trump, would often refer to his brilliant MIT professor uncle as evidence that his family was incredibly smart.
And stable.
Yeah, and stable. That's why that was a good question, right? Any others? Yes, please.
Okay, based on my knowledge, okay, you can contradict me. And apparently, Smithsonian, by the end of the 20th century, released a series of documents listing the list of major inventors in the electrical engineering story. And apparently, Nikola Tesla was not mentioned. So, have you heard about that?
Yeah, you even go to the Smithsonian Institution there, the room of electricity, which is quite expansive. And there are like 8 full-sized, statues of Thomas Edison. And there's on the wall, a tiny little picture of Nikola Tesla. And you go there and you sort of think, all right, who won the War of the Currents? What are we doing? There are some people who allege that it's, the anti-immigration bias that we just have because Thomas Edison is the American icon. I don't really buy that totally because, Marconi was, an immigrant as well, and he's revered. I think, my own thought is that what Tesla devised were sort of the underlying principles to things that people can't really understand. An electric motor, there's one in your refrigerator, but you have no idea what it does. You never see it. Thomas Edison's things were consumer products that you could touch and feel. And that's my theory as to why he became more recognized, because he gave us things that we know what they are, whereas Tesla was giving us things that were systematic and not that understandable to everybody. That's my theory.
Sure. Look, I'm a power engineer and have been trained actually in polyphase electric machines, and definitively the three-phase electric machines Tesla. And
Yes.
nobody else.
Yes.
And without the electric machines, there is no AC power.
Yes.
Okay, and everybody is referring at Tesla as the founding father of the electric power that we have today. So how come Smithsonian do not list him as the inventor of the liquid power? And believe me or not, that's why I'm invited actually to trust. We have in the IEEE power engineering community,
Yes.
we have a website that starts to say that, which is very well documented. This is not controversial. And yet, there is a certain number of key big guys in the IEEE start to argue with me that, okay, yes, Nikola Tesla did what you said, but, okay, there are many, many others who have contributed to the development of the electric power technology that we know today. So, I don't know.
Listen, you have no argument from me. I spent 4 years writing a book on the guy, so I totally agree.
Definitively, there is something very strange
Yes.
about how Nikola Tesla is treated by engineers here.
Well, my hope is that this book, as well as people like Larry Page and Elon Musk, begin to change that. Because, and I'm not doing this from the perspective of trying to criticize or demote Edison or Marconi, but it's to elevate a genius that has not been given his full due. I totally agree. Anybody else? Yes, please.
We got this sculpture of Tesla supposedly from his daughter.
Yeah, that's a
But
good
he
one.
said that he did not have a family.
Mhm.
So who is this daughter? Is somebody to be an offspring of Tesla?
He had, I think, 3 or 4 sisters. So if I had to guess, it would be a sister. None of whom really moved to the United States. And interestingly enough, they all married Orthodox priests.
But
So
it's okay. In that church, priests can marry.
yes, yeah. No, that wasn't. I wasn't comment on that, but just that they all did that. But no, he had no daughter.
So, you're not aware of any family, blood families that he had?
Again, this man wouldn't touch anybody. He did not. He did not have relationships. Let's put it that way.
And was he funny?
Yeah, people claim that he was quite charming. He was witty, and as noted, he could, go off on a tangent, quoting poetry or short stories, just at the drop of a hat. So yes, he was quite charming.
Where did he end up studying? What school?
Oh God, I knew you were going to ask that. I don't remember right off the top of my head. Gans was one university.
But was it in Austria?
It was in Eastern Europe is where he did it. Once he came here, he had finished his engineering studies and was just a full-time inventor. Anything else? Yeah, please.
So you mentioned the FBI went through all this material and then all that shipped off to the National Archives, and that's why it's there? Or
Well, actually, about 15 years later, it finally got shipped off to Serbia, to Belgrade, where they have a Nikola Tesla museum. But we copied all of his letters and or did microfiche of them or sent them the microfiche of them. So most of his actual papers are either at the Library of Congress or the archives of the Smithsonian. But the originals, or many of them, are now back in Serbia. Anything else?
Any relations with some of the famous scientists of the 20th century that you're aware of?
He was a bit of a loner when it came to science. You certainly.
Did he view himself as a scientist or more as an engineer?
I think he viewed himself as an inventor, which was the term that he preferred. When he was young, he thought that engineering was the means by which to get to be an inventor. But I think he thought at his core that that's what he was. And his friends, he had a very eclectic group of friends. In addition to Mark Twain, for heaven's sakes, John Muir, the great naturalist who brought us or saved Yosemite National Park for us, Stanford White, who was the famous architect that did of Stanford, of McKim, Mead, and White. And what two totally different people. Nikola Tesla was this germaphobe who would never, touch anyone, and Stanford White was, having affairs with, mistresses, husbands of whom shot him dead finally. But he would have parties where he'd have people, young, scantily clad women jump out of, cakes. So they were weird. But they, Stanford White built his laboratory up on Long Island, and the two of them spent, months together walking through Long Island parks and thinking about great thoughts. So it was a disparate group of friends that he was involved in. You guys out of here right now? If so, thank you. I hope you.
That was correct.